Crown Prince Noctis has finally made his way into Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, leaving many players who have access to him wondering exactly what the best way to utilize him is. Unlike a lot of characters out there, Noctis doesn't really have one exact way that you want to use him, and thus Noctis is only going to be as good as you are as a player. And this is going to boil down to how you know how to build your characters for the things that you want them to do, your team composition based around that character and their fight you're going to try to accomplish and beat, as well as the various game mechanics in Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. So strap in, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be the Master's Guide to Crown Prince Noctis. As we get into it, we're going to be going over the basic skills that you're going to be using the most on Noctis real quickly. This is going to be his Warp Strike Plus skill, as well as his Limit Burst Armiger Unleashed, and then his Awakened skill, Awakened Armiger Plus. Warp Strike Plus is going to be a chain finish skill you're going to be able to buff up with other various skills such as Royal Arm skills like Scepter of the Pious, Sword of the Wise, Axe of the Conqueror, Blade of the Mystic, Sword of the Tall, and Star of the Rogue. In addition to those Royal Arm skills, he does also have the Protection of the Lineage, Fire, Ice, and Lightning, which will give a small multiplier, but for a 3-turn duration instead of a 1-turn duration, so you can eke out just a little bit more burst damage on a following turn. His Awakened Limit Burst here, the Armiger Unleashed, does a substantial amount of damage, but each of these skills has a certain thing you need to know about them, and we'll get into that a little bit later. The powerful buffs that he does have access to from the different Royal Arms enable Noctis to either self-buff himself while giving Point Blank Warp Strike Plus an increase to the damage it does that turn, as well as allowing him to do bonus damage versus various enemy types in the game, such as humans, demons, undeads, and fairies. These allow Noctis to do an extreme amount of damage with the proper build to the right enemies. So with the basics of Noctis out of the way, let's quickly talk about some of the more notable characters that you can have in your team composition for Noctis. These are going to be first and foremost characters who can either imbue you or imperil for you. This is going to depend on what sort of build you have. If you're using 2 non-elemental weapons, you're definitely going to want to have someone imbue your character. This is going to add an elemental affinity to their physical attacks for a certain duration of time, and imperils are going to give the enemy a weakness to a certain elemental for a period of time. You want these to match. So if you have a water imbue, you want a water imperil. Lots of characters are used for these sort of circumstances, and some of the more popular ones nowadays, there are plenty more than this though, are characters like CG Nicole or Maritime Strategist Nicole, Folka, Ignis, Ignacio, Edgar, King of Figaro, Sacred Shield Charlotte, Sieghart, Summer Lynn, Fiona, Sylvie, and Warrior of Dawn Galoof, as well as Luna Freya, who also was on the banner with him. There are more characters that do this, but these are just some examples of characters that you may want to have in your party to take full advantage of the elemental debuff system in Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. Moving into builds, a lot of players out there have been asking the question, how do I build them? Do I build them true double hand? Do I build them true dual wield? Do I stack limit burst damage? What about killers? What about his attack stat? How do I balance all of this stuff with Noctis? And that's the key. You need to find the proper balance in all of these builds in order to extract the full amount of power you can from this character. So here we go with some starter builds here with Quicksilver and Longinus, as well as some high attack. As you can see here, we're trying to balance limit burst damage as well as killers for whatever Esper or battle we're going into. So if we're going against a human, we're going to have Diablo, so we're going to have a Man-Eater Plus equipped. We're going to put in some limit burst damage as well. You can use non-elemental weapons if you want to. If you have an imbuer, you can go high attack non-elemental weapons. If you want to use an elemental weapon on your true dual wield Noctis, you can do that as well. An intro true double hand build is probably something you're not going to want to go for. You're stuck with a low attack true double hand weapon. You need to cap out your true double hand. You really just don't get the attack percent. You don't get access to the limit burst damage. You don't get access to as many killer slots. You don't have the flexibility of having an elemental weapon equipped as an intro level character here, and this is going to be reflected in the data that we'll go into with the spreadsheets. Moving into more advanced build, guys, remember, this isn't something you have to make him good. This is to show you what sort of gear you're looking for as you're upgrading from these TMR only builds with sort of super TMRs really set him apart. The other builds we're going to be going over today are more endgame oriented builds. These 4 different builds will be built in 4 different ways, each of them trying to do a specific thing, and we'll be able to figure out which one is going to be best for what you want to do with your Noctis. That way you'll be able to have an option or an opinion of something that you want to work towards for how you want to use your character in the long term. We'll be talking about exactly what makes those builds strong, what sets them apart, and we're going to have the math to back it up for you guys. So these 4 different builds here, we're gonna have 2 different true dual wield builds, one build without limit burst damage really in mind. We're just trying to get as much attack as possible, fit killers in there, all of that good stuff. The other build is going to be true dual wield as well, and it's also going to be built not only for traditional killers and attack, but also limit burst damage. Then we have true double hand builds for you guys. One of them is going to be focused around just doing as much raw damage as possible. We're not building anything at all for limit burst damage on this build. And then the last build is going to be another true double hand build that's going to try to balance attack percent, true double hand percent, limit burst damage percent, and killer percent all at the same time. With this in mind, guys, let's go check out how these builds actually operate, as well as the mechanics behind Noctis's skills and how they're going to affect his damage in the long term. So as we move into these builds, we're going to be using the same sets of circumstances for all of these builds. We're all going to be putting them up against the same exact encounters, the same exact defense and spirit. They have the same exact elemental and perils associated with the damage. The only thing that's going to be changing is how those builds react to certain sets of circumstances. Also, Noctis, like we said before, isn't like most other characters in the game. He does not really have a set rotation. He's very similar to Regina. You can Regina Cannon when you want to. You can use your Limit Burst when you want to. Just like that, you can use Warp Strike Plus when you want to. You can use his Limit Burst when you want him to. You can also use Armor Wakes if you want to. So one of his more powerful setup turns, you can do this at turn 1, you can do this halfway through the fight, is going to be setting up for damage at a later time while surviving and using his cooldown skill. So you can use his Ice, Fire, and Thunder buff. This is going to give you a multiplier increase. It's going to last for 3 turns to his Warp Strike Plus skill. And you can go ahead and use whatever other skills you want. It could be his cooldown skill to get the 200% all stat buff and unlock Armor Wakes. You can also use his dodge skill to get 3 stacks of Mirage. Now for those turns where you want to be using Warp Strike Plus, if you have Armor Wakes unlocked, what you're going to be doing is using 3 of his killer buffs. They're going to be called in this spreadsheet. These are his Royal Arms skill. That's going to give you certain buffs and debuffs, such as Demon Killer, Man Eater, etc. And they're also going to be buffing up Warp Strike Plus. So out of your Pentacast, you're going to be casting 3 of these skills. Your 4th Pentacast is going to go to Warp Strike Plus. This is his Chain Finish move. So you're going to Chain Finish this on the monster. And then your 5th cast is going to go to Armor Wakes. And Armor Wakes is going to cast Armor Wakes for you automatically 6 to 8 times. So average 7 casts. So yes, even though you can only Pentacast with Noctis, Armor Wakes itself treats itself differently and is going to automatically cast like a barrage style move after you chain finish. You're going to want to be doing this with a CG Noctis friend. That way they can both go in there in Armor Wakes. Armor Wakes doesn't really have a chaining family outside of itself, and it's going to cast, like I said, 7 times on average. It will break between each cast, so assuming you're elemental spark chaining, you're going to not be hitting nearly a high multiplier. You're never going to hit a 4.0 multiplier on these skills. You're going to be sitting at around a 2.8 to 3.08 multiplier, depending on if you're spark chaining in single elemental chaining. But it is going to cast 7 times, and this is going to do a substantial amount of damage. So this is the true dual wield build with 100% in peril. We have our killers activated, which was 250% on this specific build, and you can see that the true wield build with this Armor Wakes turn is taking the breath out of my lungs. It's going to do just under 1 million damage to a 100 defense target. If you put this up against a 1 defense target, that's going to be 100 million damage. So that's pretty strong there. Overall, cumulatively with all of this crazy stuff, you have the elemental spark chain. His limit burst also does break. It is one other caveat to this character, and it's going to break between the damaging part and the non-damaging part. What do I mean by that? So even though his limit burst is 20 hits, it is very backloaded. If you guys don't know what that means, it means that the majority of the damage actually comes after the first few hits and it's going to break. So it's going to have the second hit do a 21 elemental chain. So the 22 hits is the second part after breaks, and that's where the majority of the damage goes. That's why the limit burst here is broken up to 2 different parts. With that weighting applied to the first part, it's going to be a 4.4 multiplier or so. It's going to do a little bit of damage, and then it's going to break. You're going to hit around a 3.38 if you're elemental spark chaining multiplier there. Then it's going to break, and you're going to be left with the remaining 32.56 multiplier of his limit burst armor girl unleashed there. You can hit a 3.5 multiplier with elemental spark chaining, and you do 692 million damage. Now you can see that this is a substantial amount of less damage than his triple killer buff Warp Strike plus Armor Wake's turn. So this is going to be a way for you to go in there and do a bunch of damage. Now remember, you have to have Armor Wakes unleashed, and you do want another Noctis friend to go ahead and do that damage too. Now there's one other thing you can do with his limit burst to squeeze out just a little bit more damage from it if you want. And remember, I did say that that limit burst does break between the 2 different parts. If you've ever used it before, you can see he goes in there, flashes around like a ninja, that it breaks, and then he comes in, overhead slams, and blows up the world. What you can do is you can put a support chain in there and bridge the gap between the 2 different parts of the chain. This way you're going to be building a chain with the first non-damaging parts of his limit burst, so this part does not change at all whatsoever, but instead of it being a 3.5 multiplier on the chain multiplier on that second part of the limit burst, you're going to be able to maintain that 4.0, and you're going to be able to squeeze out just a little bit more damage for this character, going from 784 million to 884 million damage in this circumstance. If you compare this to his true double hand build, and thankfully the rest of these aren't going to be as lengthy due to us going through the explanations here on this first one, you're going to see a substantial amount of not really much change at all. So whether you have true dual wield gear for him, whether you have true double hand gear for him, you can kind of do right around the same amount of damage. True dual wield though will probably be better for you guys, especially if you're using the newer builds, and this is going to change later on for the high tier builds, because it's going to be much more flexible for you guys to put in the right killers, the limit burst damage gear. Once you get the different one-handed weapons from a lot of different trials, those are going to have 75% killers on them that you may or may not use, which is going to change what build is going to be better for you. So true dual wield is definitely something you want to look into. True double hand does eke out just a little bit more damage for the Armor Wake's turn. Moving into the 4 endgame builds that we're going to be showing today, we're going to be looking at 2 true dual wield builds and 2 true double hand builds. One of each of those is going to be focused around attack damage in killers. The other one's gonna be focused around attack damage, killers, and limit burst damage. We're gonna be showing off these in 4 sets of circumstances for you guys, so you guys can get a full in-depth idea of just how important it is to know the mechanics behind Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. We're gonna be showing all 4 sets of gear without killers factored in, with killers factored in, with Noctis's own killers on his buffs factored in, and then one special setup that you can do to truly maximize the amount of damage the king can do in one turn. So let's talk about the true dual wield Noctis build without limit burst damage in mind. We're not really trying to max it out. If it's there, it just happens to be there. And this is going to be what we're looking at here. So total damage here on one of his turns, really nothing super crazy here as far as it goes for his Armor Wake's turns or anything like that. These are going to be smaller numbers than the other 2 because remember guys, we're not factoring killers in. So we have 342 million damage on his Armor Wakes, 207 on a limit burst, and if you bridge that gap, you keep the limit burst from breaking, 233 million. If you compare that to the true dual wield build, 325 on the Armor Wake's turn, 298 million from a limit burst, or 336 million if you bridge that gap there. So you eke out just a little bit more extra damage with Armor Wakes with true dual wield Noctis, but you also lose quite a substantial amount of damage from your limit burst. So right now, if you're using the limit burst, there's absolutely no reason to not be building a true dual wield Noctis for limit burst. And you also don't really gain that much damage from the Armor Wake's turn. If you go to true double hand with no limit burst here, you can see that the Armor Wake's turn does a substantial increase in damage so far, because it's 447 million damage here compared to the other 2 builds' best 325 million. However, the limit burst is lacking just a little bit behind the limit burst build that was true dual wield, 252 million. Right around there, 280 something million right around there compared to the just around 300 million from the true dual wield builds. Now you also notice one other thing is that the logarithmic formula doesn't really change the numbers for these builds that much, especially does not give that giant penalty to true double hand builds because we're not using a 135 attack weapon anymore. We're up near the 180 cap. Now, moving into the true double hand Noctis limit burst build, you're going to notice something very odd here, and this is going to show you guys exactly how powerful gearing your characters for the situation is, aka why Fenrir is a terrible unit. So if you're looking at this right here, you see that the true double hand Noctis build for limit burst damage is still out damaging the straight attack Noctis built without limit burst damage in mind. The non-limit burst damage Noctis is only doing 447 million damage here in this calculation versus the limit burst damage Noctis is doing 450 million. And this is on the Armiger Wake's turn, and then the limit burst damage Noctis is out damaging the straight true double hand Noctis with limit burst as well. So what is going on here? Well, this is because the true double hand Noctis with limit burst damage in mind doesn't have as many killer slots available to him as the true double hand non-limit burst damage Noctis, and we're going to be seeing that pretty shortly. So let's move into the true dual wield build here. This is true dual wield build, no limit burst damage gear in mind, so the build hasn't changed, but we're going to be factoring in killers now. And all of these builds except for one, and I'll give you guys a hint or a guess at which one that is going to be able to cap out 300% killers against this particular subject here. This is going to be the no limit burst damage true dual wield build. And you'll see a substantial jump in damage once killers are starting to be factored in. 1.371 billion damage before the old logarithmic formula, 1.4 billion damage from an Armiger Wake's turn after that formula. The limit burst is going to do anywhere from 853 million to 962 million. And remember, this is against a 100 defense target. If you're someone who likes to calculate against one defense, just multiply these numbers by 100, and that's how much damage you'd be doing if you want to compare calculations and other aspects. Now let's compare this true dual wield build that's not built around limit burst damage to one that is, and you're going to see a substantial increase in the limit burst damage here starting right now. 1.1 billion damage, 1.2 billion damage, 1.4 billion damage from a limit burst if you can bridge the gap, which is a substantial increase. Armiger Wake still is doing a substantial amount of damage, 1.3 billion damage, and that's because the true dual wield build is so easy to cap killers and attack on. You can still fit the limit burst damage in there, so there's no real reason not to build true dual wield and limit burst, guys. So get that. You can do it. That's one of the best parts about true dual wield. It's pretty easy and flexible in doing all three things at the same time, so there's no reason not to. Now, let's look at true double hand Noctis built for killers and damage, though, foregoing that limit burst, because what you can still see is that the Armiger Wake's turn, if you have the second Noctis, if you have everything set up for it, if you have the chain finish for it for that turn, it does more damage than his limit burst, especially even if you're built for limit burst damage. So why don't we try to maximize that? So true double hand Noctis, no limit burst damage gear really factored into our builds on purpose. 1.788 billion damage, or after the logarithmic formula, 1.777 billion damage, which is a pretty significant increase over anything else. The limit burst that it does do is still over 1 billion damage, because even though we're not building for limit burst damage, we still have 30% on Black Sparky, which helps us out, and we still have that 150% limit burst damage buff from using arm or a warp strike plus here. So that's going to help us out, and we're still using a two-handed weapon, so we get that nice 50% weapon variance, whereas the true dual wield builds are only at a 1.05 from using 11 super TMR. And if you don't have 11 super TMR, this is going to be a 1.0 for you, because most one-handed weapons don't have high attack and weapon variance at the same time. There's nothing else in the game quite like 11 super TMR. So let's go ahead and compare the limit burst here. 1 billion, 1.1 billion. You can see that the limit burst for the true dual wield build does do a little bit more damage, but we're really not trying to use a limit burst. And if you want to, you're not taking the most sizable amount. So the biggest limit burst damage the true dual wield build has right now is 1.379 billion. The true double hand, 1.1 billion damage. So 200 million damage lost there, but you gain way more than 200 million damage on the Armiger Wake's turn. So every turn you Armiger Wakes, you do that combo, you chain finish and then, 6 to 8 casts of Armor Awakes, you're gaining, over 450 million damage on that turn, which is an insane amount of damage to be talking about there for sure. Now let's compare the two true double hand builds. Remember, the other build with the killers and the limit burst that was built before was winning by a substantial margin. But now, if you go down here, you're going to see that it still does a lot of damage with Armor Awakes, but now it's definitely losing in this build race here. 1.57 billion on the true double hand limit burst damage built versus the 1.78. Also, the limit burst damage that it gains isn't that much more than what we had on the true double hand build, because it gained limit burst damage, but we still have more killer, and we still have a sizable amount of limit burst damage on our non-limit burst build. So even though it beats us by a little bit, it's only beating us by a small, teeny tiny microscopic amount. So there's no reason to trade off doing much more damage on the Armor Awakes turn for a tiny amount of increase using your limit burst. Now there's one last thing that we can talk about here, and this is going to be what happens when you have his buffs active as well. So Noctis's buffs are actually really strong as killer buffs. They are buffs, so they're going to go over top of that cap that's in the game. Remember guys, the caps are really only there for passives, right? 400% attack cap doesn't keep you from getting an additional attack buff in combat. The same is true for other buffs in the game as well. So all of these different buffs that he has access to not only are very strong because the numbers are very high, but they're against some of the more common enemy types in the game, such as humans and demons, which are two of the most common enemy types in FFBE. So what happens when you run into those enemies? Let's take a quick look. The true dual wield build, not built for limit burst damage, all of a sudden is doing crazy amounts of damage, going up to what we were used to seeing from the true double hand build, 1.8 billion damage on Armor Awakes, and then 1.1 to 1.3 billion damage on the limit burst. The true dual wield build with the limit burst is going to still be doing just under 1.8 billion damage before we hit the weapon log formula, so 1.8 still with the Armor Awakes turn, and then 1.7 and then 1.9 billion damage if you can hit that limit burst and then go ahead and bridge that gap. You're going to be doing close to 1.9 billion damage. The true double hand build with no limit burst damage built, how much is this guy going to hit for? And he hits like a truck. 2.459 billion damage. That's right, just under 2.5 billion damage, and this is against a 100 defense target. So if you want to once again multiply by that 100 mark, yes, you're going to be doing 250 billion damage in one turn with one Noctis. So if you're doing two Noctises that have the same exact build, true double hand, in the same scenario, 100% in peril, all of the killers in the world ready to rock and roll with his self buff up on turn 2, 500 billion damage in those calculations. Absolutely insane. This is why he can be built around a team and do so much damage. What about that limit burst damage build, the true double hand Noctis? 2.25 billion, still very strong here. What's his limit burst looking like now? 1.5 and 1.7 billion versus the other true double hands, 1.3 and 1.5. So basically still the same thing. Almost no reason not to use the true double hand build if you want to go access to the Armor Awakes turn. Now there's one last thing we can look at today, guys, and that's going to be stacking all of this stuff in the right circumstances for a one big burst turn with Zargobath's Berserk. So you can get in there. How hard can you hit? We have the 100% Imperial. We have the killer buffs up. We have all of these top end builds. What is the numbers that we're going to be hitting with these characters? So this is the true dual build. He's got his killers active. This is the no limit burst damage build. He's got Zargobath's Berserk up. 2.4 billion damage on the Armor Awakes turn. 1.5 to 1.65 billion damage from the limit burst. The true dual wield Noctis limit burst build is coming in here looking fresh. 2.3 billion damage on Armor Awakes, 2.1 to 2.3 billion damage with the limit burst. So if you can bridge the gap on his limit burst, he's doing as much damage as he would be doing on his Armor Awakes turn, which is pretty substantial to be talking of, especially. What about the true double hand max attack build? It hits 3,800 attack, and it's going to be doing on the Armor Awakes turn 3.1 billion damage on that turn. 310 billion per Noctis against a 1 defense target calculation, 620 billion damage with one of these top end builds. And then lastly, the Limit Burst True Double Hand build, still swinging hard. 2.8 billion, 1.9 billion, and 2.1 billion damage. Absolutely incredible, these different builds at the end of the day. It doesn't really matter which one you want to do. If you're all in on Armor Awakes, that's how I'm going to build my Noctis, because it is one of the easier things. You just need a chain finish on one turn, and he's going to take care of the rest for you. As you can see right here, the chain finish is 2 billion of the damage. The Armor Awakes makes up the rest of the 1 billion of the damage there. So even if you somehow didn't chain finish this whatsoever, you'd still be doing a considerable amount of damage, 1.5 billion damage here, which would be absolutely insane. But this is more than enough damage to end most fights in the game in 1 or 2 hits. And if you want to go ahead in a build like this, a team composition like this, I'm gonna be building a team composition like this eventually one day, once to get enough UFC tickets for my boy. But this can be the second round, because remember, you have Armor Awakes unlocked for more than 1 turn, so you can go in there, killer buff, Warp Strike plus Armor Awakes. Next turn, do it again, and then cast Berserk on both their characters and end the fight. So very interesting stuff. Hopefully this guys gave you a quick peek into the nonsense that is the damage formula in FFBE, as well as the best ways to build and utilize Noctis. If so, guys, go ahead. You want to see more stuff like this, let me know down in the comment section below. Tell me what your Noctis team is going to be. Let me know what sort of gear you're looking for. And let me know if this changed your mind on how you thought you were going to be building Noctis, or just kind of confirmed how you thought you'd be doing yourself a service by putting Noctis in your team, guys. Anyways, guys, I'll see you guys in the next one. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you later.